Now, you probably already know Stephen Hay, right? From California originally, but living right here in the Netherlands. Stephen used to be cool. He used to have a really good blog, The Haystack. That was good. And hey, remember earlier when I was talking about Rachel having written 22 books? That's nothing. Stephen wrote a book once. It was very good, responsive design workflow. But since then, he's kind of sold out, and he's gone to work for the man. I mean, he's literally working at a bank. You couldn't have more of a sellout than Stephen Hay. But I have to admit, he's a talented young fellow. I mean, you're looking at all the lovely design language stuff here for CSS Day. That was Stephen's work. I mean, he ripped it off from Day Still, obviously, but Stephen's work there. And I do have to concede that when he gives talks, they're really, really good. Like last time he gave a talk at CSS Day, it was about the lies that design systems tell. You saw that talk, it was awesome. I literally said to him, you're going to have to come and give that talk at my conference. So I just love how pretentious his talks are. The big picture. No, seriously, they're great, philosophical things. Anyway, as I mentioned, it's an important day today for Stephen. So normally I'd introduce the speaker and you'd give a round of applause, but this time, come on up here, Stephen. I want you to sing a welcome to Stephen with the words of the song Happy Birthday. Now, he's not revealing to me exactly how old he is. I see some gray hairs in there, but we don't care. We're going to sing. So, all together now. Stephen Hay, everybody. Thank you.
I'm not sure how one follows an introduction like that. That's thank you to all of you. That's probably the biggest happy birthday I've gotten ever. Now I have to collect my thoughts. Usually I make a joke at the beginning of a talk, but then I realize I'm not funny, so I can't do that. Case in point. So I'll start off seriously, and that is that today is a special day, 10 years of CSS Day. Probably, I think the only CSS conference that I know that still exists at this scale, and we've seen a lot of great stuff. So I was happy to be involved with the organization of it early on, in the early days, and we've seen cool stuff in the last 10 years. And it's a privilege to be here and stand in front of you today and hopefully take you back a little bit and give you some things to think about. So I'm going to show you a lot of pictures today. And the reason this is all important, the CSS stuff, is because it was different at some point way back in the day. In 1991, we had this website, and this has like a strange, satisfying appeal to me, this idea of just text with hyperlinks. I thought it was really cool back then, and you didn't really need a whole lot. You couldn't do a whole lot, that's for sure. And then about, let's say, 4 years later, you got things like this. Anyone remember Hotwired? Yeah? One person? Great. Okay. Yeah, Hotwired, which was kind of a magazine. I like to read it, and it was pretty nice, but this is kind of like an image map. So not a lot of people use image maps nowadays. My first website was in 1995, and I used server-side image maps. I don't even know if you can do that today. But it's basically a picture, and then you could put like hot areas or click areas on there. This was Microsoft's website. Purveyors of excellent design. at Microsoft in 1994. So once you started getting this kind of table layout and these kind of image map type things, everybody started doing this. So here's another one, Silicon Graphics, based on tables. So table-based layout, people figured out how to do that, and then it just kind of continued. And we looked at all these websites in Netscape at the time, which was really cool. I mean, if you looked at what we had before that, this was like a big step. And then people did kind of the same things for a few years, and then we got this new aesthetic around 2000, which was kind of, I don't know what you would call it, like cyber, you know. What do you call this? Is there a word for it? But a lot of stuff looked like this, and it felt futuristic. People really liked doing that. Zeldman, many of you maybe know Jeffrey Zeldman. I thought this site was really cool. It was quirky, interesting color combinations, stuff like that. And a lot of this stuff was based on tables and floats and things like that. Two Advanced Studios, which was pretty popular. So some of you might remember them. This is kind of combining the cyber with some functionality. So this was really popular. This Flight 404, Robert Hodgins' site, which was always inspirational. He was doing all kinds of cool visualization stuff. K10K, anyone remember K10K? Yeah, it was all this pixel stuff, pixel art, but everything was drawn with pixels. It looked really cool, fun to read. And this is Todd Domini's site, What Do I Know? With this kind of typography, this idea of a newspaper type of thing. So you could see that design was getting a little bit better with the tools that we had. So people were kind of trying to push the envelope that we had at the time. In the clear left, Jeremy's, Jeremy and Richard and Andy's company. The thing I like about this one is the call now at the top. Call now. It's like, order your pizza now, you know. Jason Santa Maria, this is all kind of playing with the idea that you have, you're limited in terms of layout, but what can you do like with background images and things like that? So this is kind of what the web looked like. Not the standard web. The standard web was more boring than these sites, but I think that's always the case. Khoi Vin's site. Khoi Vin's a graphic designer, and you could see that already in the early days. So this was early days, like 2003, I think, something like that. So basically, we saw the web go from the first, McDonald's site in 1994 to 30 years later, and that's what happened. So that's it. But something happened in between, and that's CSS Zen Garden. And Dave Shea has been at this conference before, and he's talked about his little creation, which was a great idea. This idea that you can use HTML, you can't touch it, you can only write CSS for it and include images and fonts and things like that. And what could you make, given that constraint? You can't touch the HTML. So aside from the practical aspect of if you're working with a CMS and you can't touch any of the content, what can you do? It was just kind of a fun exercise. It was a fun thing to see. So you got these types of things, just kind of basic table-ish layout. And some of them, it's all subjective. Some you might like, some you might not. But people were trying things out. And then after a few, Dave came along and made this, which was kind of kind of a nod to David Carson, probably the surf culture type stuff. It was pretty nice. Definitely not for your client, but it was kind of fun to see that you could do this. Very clever. These kind of layouts, things that don't necessarily line up next to each other, so the more asymmetrical grid type things that people were doing. And again, you have this kind of cyber effect happening. more with typography and decorative things like that. And this was Doug Bowman's entry, first entry. You could start seeing this really strong playing around with a grid, and background images as well. So these kind of things, they're all very different. Most of these were done in the very early days, so it was kind of surprising to see what people could make with their limited amount of tools that they had at the time. And this one played a little bit with shadow and kind of overlapping things. So people would ask the question, well, how did they do this? And they'd go and they'd look at the code and figure it out. And it's not really that hard, but sometimes there are very clever, playful things being done with, say, background images and things like that. This one, which if you look at the code for this could be done in one line of code to get you this layout nowadays. But back then it was a little bit harder to do. And these types of things. So this is how we did that. So just put an image in there with the text on it and attach it to the top and make sure that you're using a PNG so that the color matches with the background of the box that you put on top of. So these were kind of fun times. You know, everyone was cowboying it a little bit. This kind of thing started happening. How could you be a little bit more creative? So you could see that they vary quite a bit. They're not all the same. This one I thought was kind of impressive, but it must have been hell to put together because you didn't have the same tools that we have now to do this type of thing. So you could see here at the bottom here, it's just barely fitting into that dialogue balloon. But this is kind of a cool thing, putting all that HTML content into a comic book. So there's a lot of creativity happening here. Here's another image of it. I don't know why I have that, but this is a little bit more modern version. So CSS Zen Garden doesn't take many submissions now, but some Dave takes, and this is kind of with a newer, more modern CSS. And it's pretty nice. It's got all these overlapping things, and there's some playfulness with opacity and things like that. The forms are SVGs. So still kind of on the creative side. And then there's this one, which is just wild. It's like, can we take every single thing that CSS does and do it on one page? Pretty cool. Probably took a while to make. But these are kind of the latest entries in the Zen Garden. So it runs the gamut, but most of the stuff was done in the early days. Something else that was done in the early days is Jeremy Keith's website, adaptio.com, and he has kind of his own little Zen Garden in there. And I'm literally going to show you all these themes. But the Zen Garden was before CSS Zen Garden, as Jeremy was keen to tell me. But it is kind of nice that you can play around. It does imply a little bit that design has nothing to do with the content. Actually, good design always has something to do with the content. There's a marriage of design with content. So it's playful, and it's like playing with the fact that you can separate these things, which is a good thing, I think, to be able to separate concerns. This was really nice. But why was the creativity getting better, even though we didn't have the tech? It's because of the constraints that we have. The constraints are, as a creative director, a lot of my work is helping other designers do work, and we're trying to figure out, a lot of designers will just want to do whatever they can do, but that's really a bad strategy most of the time. If you could do anything you want, you're not going to have the most creative ideas. So constraints are very important to coming up with good ideas. So some of you might know this chair. This is a lounge chair by Ray and Charles Eames. And they made different types of furniture. And the thing about this kind of chair is if you've ever tried to bend plywood, it's pretty hard. You can't do it. But they had this thing. This is them. It's a couple. And they had this thing called the Kazam. Ray Eames called it the Kazam. And this was kind of a box, and they had a heating element in there. And they would make really thin sheets of plywood. So they would cut it very thin. They'd put glue on it. So it's almost like baklava, if you've ever had baklava, those layers of phyllo dough, and they'd put glue in between. They'd put it on there. They'd put it in this, there's like a plaster mold on the inside. And I think in this one, you see a bicycle pump. They had a piece of rubber that they would pump up with the bicycle pump, right? Once they put the plywood in there, and it would push the plywood, the thin plywood, down into the plaster mold, and then the heating element would help the glue dry. And then when that was done, they'd repeat that process. So they were able to bend plywood. So that's their constraint was plywood is not bendable. It forced them to come up with a new process, which is amazing. So that's creativity. This is Blender. A lot of you know Blender. Originally started by Ton Roosendaal. That's a Dutch guy who's a self-trained software developer. And so, which is amazing to me. It's like I'm a self-trained developer. I'm going to build a 3D program, But he did it, and Blender didn't do a whole lot in the very beginning. So what they had was projects. Every single year, they'd get a group of people together, like a director and artists and other 3D people, and they would figure out what was needed for that particular film or game or whatever it was they were making, and then they would adjust the software. They would build on the software to be able to do that thing. So they're doing a movie that needs grass that moves. Well, they had to have static grass that worked already, but now they needed it to move, so they just rewrote some of the software to make it move. So the constraints, the parameters of the project that we're working on determined the things that they were going to do for the app itself. Which is amazing, and now it rivals a lot of the big professional pieces of software, even though it's open source. So it's a great project, and it's built by constraints that are changing all the time, which lead to these new discoveries. So we did the same with the web. We couldn't do things, and we tried different things out. So Doug Bowman had the sliding doors effect in CSS, where you wanted these tabs, but you wanted them to have these like rounded corners or a 3D effect. And they're basically just images that slide over each other to give you that effect, to make it look like you're looking at a tab that's either big or small, so you can have these different size tabs. So it was really, you could build a reputation back in the day based on one technique. I think Doug got most of his reputation because of this. So also rounded corners, but what we take for granted, border radius, everybody wanted rounded corners, everyone. And so this is an article that I wrote in 2006, so we still didn't have border radius, but it's basically a 2,000 pixel sprite sheet with not the rounded corner, but the outside of the rounded corner in the background color of the page you were working on. So you'd have to make a new sprite sheet depending on if you had a different color. It worked really well, but I had to develop another technique to make it smooth and stuff like that. Way too much time spent on rounded corners. So this is why I don't blog anymore, Jeremy. It's like down the rabbit hole with this stuff. And I think what you've seen a lot today, this idea of layout. This layout was extremely hard. They called it the Holy Grail because everyone was trying to find it. And how do we make this? So they tried it with tables. They did it. People did it with tables. They floated things. They had fake background images that made it look like this, and they'd just have text like floated or positioned on top of it. They did all kinds of things to try to get this layout. Why everyone wanted this layout, I have no idea. But the point is that if we have a specific goal in mind, we get creative when we're faced with the constraints. It pushes us to become creative. So if you're ever stuck for an idea, one thing to do is just think up some constraints, make it up. You know, when I started, back when I did print design, one of the tricks we did was, what if we had to do this in black and white? You know, we had no color. What if it had to be done like this afternoon? How would we approach it then? Just giving yourself these weird what-if scenarios will trigger something. You'll let go of these preconceived ideas you have about what the project should be, and it can help you. So this idea of I want this, whatever it is, and I have these constraints, what can I do to reach that goal anyway? So there's this idea, this theory called the hedonic treadmill. Some people call it hedonic adaptation. And it's this idea that let's say Jeremy makes €2,000 a month. He buys the things he buys, he gets his coffee, maybe makes his own coffee, and now suddenly his salary doubles, he gets $4,000 a month. The idea of the hedonic treadmill is that you're gonna be like, wow, I have so much money. And then after a while, you're gonna go back to your baseline. So he's got a more expensive coffee, but it's still the coffee. And then he doesn't end up having a surplus of money. So he just kind of gets on that treadmill again. It's kind of returning to your baseline. And we kind of do that. So remember in 1991, we had just all the text-based sites with links. That's all we had. And then from 1994, 95, up to pretty close to 2000, maybe 1999, it was kind of the same type of thing. So someone made some discoveries. They pushed the envelope a little bit. Everyone got excited about that. They started doing it, and then they were like a hamster on a wheel. It stays the same for a while until one person is like, I want to try something, but I don't know how to do it, so I'm going to figure out a way to do it. And then everyone's like, oh, we can do that too. And then the cycle keeps going like that. And we see that all the time because according to science, all websites look the same, apparently, according to science, right? You've probably all seen this, the two possible websites. Dave Ellis made this one, it's very famous. We're unique, find out how unique. Always 3 columns. It's so true. That's why we can laugh about it. It's really true. It's slightly different now, but not a whole lot different now. So Chris Coyier had a nice article about this idea, and he said if design uniqueness was a lever that you could pull for increased success in any type of business, you'd better believe it would be pulled a lot more often. Now, I love Chris, and I did once save his laptop in Germany because he accidentally left it in a restaurant, but I don't quite agree with him on this one. And the reason is, design does make a difference in your business, but it's hard. And people don't like hard. If you have the choice between, I'm going to use this template that someone made for me, or I'm going to design something new, a lot of people will go for the template because not everyone feels like a designer. It's hard work to design. It's just as hard as anything else. And so people who argue with me about this, I always tell them, what kind of phone do you have? How many people have an iPhone? Yeah, most of you. I don't, which is kind of weird, but it's, why do you have the iPhone? I know there's probably a few that would be like, I have it because, it's got a really good camera or whatever. But most people who use Apple products they identify with this aesthetic that Apple has. Aesthetic is a part of the function. Victor Papanek, a designer in the 70s, once said that aesthetics is part of the function. So my manager always says the form of a chair is the thing that allows you to sit in it. So aesthetics are very important, and we don't want to admit it all the time, but that's how we act as consumers. Given two things, we'll choose the one that feels nicer, that looks nicer to our own tastes. And those tastes differ, but that is one of the main reasons people use an iPhone. It's easy to use, but it's easy to use also because of the aesthetic. So design is really important, does make a big difference for businesses as well. So Kevin Powell made a video, as he does. And this video was, can I clone this fun effect from CSS Day using modern CSS? I thought it was a weird video title before I watched it, because of course you could do that technique with modern CSS. I mean, I wish I had modern CSS back when I wrote it. This is the effect we're talking about. This is the original one from 2013. You have these speakers, tried to make it responsive, and the idea was you just see their eyes. So Krain and I were having a conversation. It was like, what if you couldn't see the speakers? What if you could just see their eyes? You had to kind of guess, so we wanted to make like a game out of it. But there was kind of a cheat code to the game, which is you could either hover over them or hover over the links, but you didn't have to. You know, we had the names. That we just thought it would be fun. It's just like a quirky thing, and it wasn't like completely self-evident how you would make this. So a lot of people would have to go and look at the code back then. Now, super easy. And the thing I was wrong about before I watched Kevin's video was I thought, well, of course you could do it with modern CSS, but that wasn't his point. And this is, there's always one guy, right? So Kevin's is more clean, isn't it? It's like, that airplane really is faster than that car, you know? Of course, Kevin's is a lot cleaner because we have better CSS, which I'm really glad for. And you did fix the Z-index issue, so thank you for that. But this, the video was more about exploring. It's like, I know I could do it in modern CSS, but how would I do it? How would I approach it? What's one of the many thousand different ways that I can approach this now with CSS, because we have so many ways to do whatever it is we want to do. And it was really good. If you get a chance to watch that video, it's a lot of fun to see the thought process that Kevin goes through. So Kevin asked a question. The question was, how would I approach this if I were doing that same effect today? So that's the question. And the questions you ask yourself are the things that will lead to the results you get. So they're very important. What is the question you're asking yourself? And especially now when we have really almost all the tools that we need, except for slot tab somewhere in here. We talked about it yesterday. Slot would make us be able to style bits of a grid layout that don't have a container in them, which would be awesome. So please add that. But when you have all the tools that you want, you really need to focus on what questions you're asking. So I'll give you some questions. So you'll get these slides probably. So I'm not sure how Krain and PPK do that, or just come up and ask me. But these questions are really important. These are questions that you would typically find like in a design studio when we're trying to get people unstuck. Think about what the real purpose is of what you're doing. This is the why. Why are you doing this in the first place? You have to keep it in mind because sometimes we tend to go down rabbit holes, especially with cool things like CSS. We'll go down all kinds of rabbit holes and forget why we're doing something in the first place. The second one is what's your intention. Very important to think about what your end goal is, what you're trying to achieve. And the last one is what would you do if you could ignore any of the existing options. This kind of gets you out of your comfort zone. So this is what a lot of people have with design systems. They have this problem where nothing's creative. No one wants to work with the system. It's all boring. You know, I just have to pull from the components that are there. So there's got to be a way for people to try new things out and then you have, say, a review process or whatever, but they need to be able to think about, what if I didn't have any of these predetermined things that don't know about my particular use case? This is a good question to ask. And it's important to be honest about the questions that you're asking. Are you doing it for designer or developer experience? Is it really for you? It's not for the user. It's actually for you. That's fine. Just admit it. Because you're doing things, convincing yourself that it's for the user, for example, but it's actually for you. I just want to try that cool new thing out. Are you really using that framework because it's better? Or are you doing something, you're just kind of fulfilling your own need, which is completely fine. But we try to deceive ourselves a little bit with this kind of stuff. So there's, I think, some things that are important to think about with CSS. If I look at the web, Oliver Reichenstein said that the web is 95% typography. I would agree with that. In 2009, when I was only 15 years old, I gave this talk at Frontiers about layout. And type and layout, the two most important things. We went so long on the web without layout. And I'm so glad that we have it, because these two things together, if you do nothing else, you can make really beautiful stuff. Type and layout, that's it. It's like, if the web's 95% typography, of the remaining 5%, you have to give 4% to layout. There's just no way around it. So in this talk, I talked about Flexbox, I talked about grid and template layout, and the grid and template layout specs weren't there, the working drafts weren't finalized until 2 years after that. But you could read what people were writing, what proposal was there. So we didn't have any of these yet. But it was fun to take a look at. And I thought that the grid syntax that Microsoft came up with, which is very useful, it reminded me of, not of this. This is kind of how I see a grid. It's like a pegboard that you can just kind of hang things on, and you create these areas. But Microsoft spec reminded me of this, that table thing that you get in Word. So you could say, I want 5 columns, 2 rows, which is super useful, don't get me wrong. I love that. But as a designer, you don't tend to think this way. At least most designers I know. Designers tend to think this way. Just draw stuff, right? And I got addicted to this idea of the template. Bert Boss's template syntax. It was so cool because they called it the ASCII art syntax. Like it was a bad thing, but it's a really good thing because I could draw in letters the same way I would draw this thing on paper, pretty much. So I started doing this weird thing. I think Nicole Sullivan had we kind of had this weird hobby at a certain point of tweeting out websites that we'd seen and what the layout would be like in one line. Nicole, I think I've seen you do that a few times, but it was a weird hobby. I don't know. Especially for back then, because the spec wasn't there. So people were like, what the hell are you talking about? What is that, But the template syntax makes it possible to kind of sketch in text. You don't even have to use paper if you don't want to. So that Holy Grail layout, it's one line. That's pretty cool. And you might not use the exact same values that are in here, but this is how simple it is compared to what it was before. I love this. And if Matthias said this morning that 12% of people are using grid layout, even less are using the template syntax, which is there. It's been there for like 6 years, 7 years. So you could use it. And you could make things, what Hida talked about in 2018 here, graphic design for the web. You want more graphic design because it does help your business. You can do basically any layout you want. This is the same layout. Looks like that. And you know, again, if you were doing this in production, you might choose different values because you're going to worry about how do I want this to be responsive, etc. But this, you can come up with this in just a minute or two. You can literally write this out. So it's literally like sketching in code, which is amazing to me. So the strings actually look like the thing that you're making. So I wanted a chance to use Adam's open props gradients. So I made this little thing. There are lots of ways to combine this grid layout, this template syntax with, say, has and variables. So here we have the article layout. You could see it right up there. And what we do is when we have a hero section at the top, just completely change the layout. You would never do this, especially this design. But you could think about all these possibilities by putting a layout as a variable and changing bits of it or the whole thing depending on whether or not you have a certain bit of content. Is there an image? Is there a sidebar? Has the user closed the sidebar, yes or no? And you can do it all with CSS. It is amazing, you know? So use it. It's really nice. All these things, I think has is one of the biggest things. I think Harry Roberts once said that CSS is pretty much just a list of conditionals, but this adds so much power to that. So CSS has become kind of a way to sculpt, and we've heard a little bit about Figma today. And Figma is a great tool, and it has its place, and I think you can use it. And sometimes people think I'm down on designers using it. But I think we use CSS, we don't use it enough, CSS enough as a design tool. My daughter is 16, she's into horror movies now, and so we were debating about what's the scariest horror movie of all time. And so I was thinking, maybe it's Lake Mungo, pretty scary ghost story. And I was looking at this, and then I looked at the type, and I thought, I have to have an example for CSS Day. I like that type. It's got kind of a shimmer. So what if I were going to start making something like just brainstorming something for a movie, like a horror movie about CSS? You know, what might I start with just to kind of get the creative juices flowing? So I'd have to have an H1, right? And I'll call the movie Shimmer, right? But because it's a horror movie, you need a tagline. So let's make a grid, because we're kind of talking about grids. So you just make a grid. Don't really need it, but you can. And then put that tagline on the grid so that it kind of overlaps the H1. And you get this kind of thing. Doesn't look like the mood. You know, it doesn't feel scary. You probably wouldn't watch it. So we need to blur that so it kind of looks like this, but it's still kind of boring. So I want it to kind of vary because I want the shimmer effect to happen. So how would I do that? There's a ton of ways to do it because we have a lot of tools now in CSS. But the way I chose was, okay, let's just put a mask on top of it. So you get this kind of thing, which you don't see it. It's very... If you were going to make a whole page, you can kind of feel that there would be a mood in here. And then let's just animate the mask position so that it just kind of moves, right? And let's do that on scroll. Why not? So here. Shimmery. Ah! Jump scare. It's possible to do a jump scare in CSS. That's how you do a jump scare. But the idea is what I was doing when I was doing this, I was just kind of having fun. It's not, you know, that's not a whole serious thing, but just thinking about, oh, what would I do? And you go into CSS and you're playing around. And then CSS is kind of talking to you in a way. Not really, but you're having a kind of a conversation with the medium. Kind of the same way that Charles and Ray Eames did, and a lot of different types of designers do. For some reason, the designers for the web, even though we have the medium right on our laptops, you know, in our pockets, we can interact with it freely. we somehow choose not to. We create this abstraction, this proxy between our thinking and the execution. So while tools like Figma have their place, there's a value in playing around with the material. And our material as designers for the web is CSS. And the more you play around with it, you're going to discover things that give you new ideas that were different than the ones you thought about before you started playing around with CSS. So it's good to end this talk, I think, with some tips about how to be creative. Okay? Really, it's how to get off that treadmill, or how to speed that things up so that bit of treadmill, that kind of mouse in a cage type of thing, ends earlier. The first one is to think about the questions that you ask yourself. And this is what we tend to do as designers and developers on the web. We tend to let the technology inform us about the things we're going to make. So it's like, oh, I can do rounded corners. So let's see, what can I think of that has rounded corners, right? Well, I'm using this particular framework. How can I incorporate that framework into my next project? Those are the wrong questions. It has to be the opposite. It has to be, what do I want to make? And then it's, how do I do that? And I know it seems simple, but so many people fall for this trap. I fall for it all the time. And I catch myself, oh, I'm doing that thing that I always tell other people not to do, right? But don't let the available options dictate what your questions will be. This is kind of the key to making new things. Try sketching on paper and then just jumping to CSS. That's a lot of fun. And it might not work all the time, but you're going to discover things. It's a whole process of discovery and play. And collaborate with your medium. It's kind of an interaction. It's this conversation you're having with CSS once you're playing around with it. You could really see it in the work that we saw from Julia today. That she's having this conversation. She's seeing something and she's reacting to it. She's changing something. She gets some feedback. She's reacting to it. So there's a whole feedback loop that's happening. It's almost like you have a co-designer, and that's CSS. So I hope you enjoyed the first day of CSS Day, the 10th edition, and thank you very much. Yeah?
Thank you, Stephen. Have a seat so that we can be like two old men reminiscing.
My back. Oh, God.
Remember the Zen Garden?
Yeah, I remember it.
Remember doc type switching? Remember the box model hack?
Yep. Yep.
People, you need to start asking questions. Use the hashtag, you use the URL on your badge. If you don't ask enough questions, we'll just have to go get a beer early, which would be disastrous.
That's why they're not asking questions.
Duh. Constraints.
Constraints.
Not all constraints are equal. Not all constraints are good. I mean, the whole point of Atomic CSS or something like Tailwind is to constrain you, right? We heard that earlier about it. What you're allowed to do, what's available, what's possible. That doesn't feel like a creative constraint. But it's a constraint.
That's true, yeah. Not all constraints are good. I mean, you have to use common sense, I think. I think we talked about this. The constraints that you have when you're trying to use technology to force people into making certain decisions because you think they'll make the right decisions because you're forcing them to, it doesn't mean they're going to do good work. So you see that in design systems all the time. If you don't allow for any creative freedom, then people could, it's like the box of Lego that you have. I've made horrible things with Lego, even though it's possible to make good things. So I don't think technology is the way to force people to do something. So if that's the kind of constraint you're dealing with, then I don't think that's helpful.
You introduced us to the term the hedonic treadmill. to show that over time, as we get more stuff, we just get used to having that stuff.
Yes. Yeah.
Is there a term for where you want something, but then when you get it, for some reason, now you're not interested in it anymore, like a dog chasing a car, right? You wouldn't know how to drive it. Because like we really wanted rounded corners and gradients for a long time, and then we got them and we went, nah, flat design, that's fine. And now we got container queries, fantastic. I don't see that many people using these things. Is there a treadmill for that?
I think it's related, but you're kind of adapting to what you have, I guess. So, but I don't know. I don't know if there's a specific name. But we see it with grid too. I mean, everyone wanted grid, and now who's using it? A lot of people are using it. Yeah, you're at a CSS conference. Of course, you use grid.
But real talk then, and this relates to a lot of what we've heard today. You think it's down to inertia, not necessarily the individual people who I want to use this stuff, but the systems and processes that they're forced to work within.
Yeah.
This is the way we've done things around here.
Yes.
And that moves slower than the available features we get in CSS.
Yeah. I think you have to be critical of that kind of thing. So like Sarah was saying today, whether you agree with it or not, the idea that you need to look critically at what you're doing and maybe shake things up a bit is a good message. And I think you should do that. You should always question, why are we doing things this way? And you might decide to stick with it, but the fact that you question it is, I think, very healthy. And also going back to what Sarah was talking about, isn't there an inherent inefficiency in constantly questioning? Like, we finally got a system that works. We know how to do things. Designer does that thing in Figma. We translate it into whatever, library we're using. Hey, it works. It ain't broke. Don't fix it. Mm-hmm. Whoever the squeaky wheel is that says, well, let's question that. Let's push back. That's inherently inefficient. It feels that way. I think eventually you're going to get answers to all your questions. You decide when you get those answers. So if you're starting a project and you avoid asking the critical questions, the difficult questions, the answer will come, but it'll come after you've built it, after people start using it. Might come like a week before you go deploy. You're going to get the answers to the questions. So why not try to get those answers early on by asking the critical thing?
Okay, but real talk. Anka on the live stream is saying what we're all thinking. Okay. She says, is there a place in the current web development, in production, like, I don't know, a bank or something, for the workflow that you describe, or is this just for funsies?
No, there's a place for it, and some of the things I've talked about we've actually implemented at the bank, especially that process of allowing people creative freedom, mostly using design tokens, and then we have a review process so that we can decide, does that fit? And if it does fit and it's not just a one-off, then we can incorporate that back into the system. You can't solve those problems without people, so you can't do it by forcing. But if you can change, any change at a large organization takes a huge amount of time. It's ridiculous, actually, how long some things take. But that's because you have so many teams. We have 120 teams working on the app. And it's hard to coordinate everybody. And so projects can take 2 years to get things done. But it is possible. So these things are not just for fun. It's not just for the barber shop around the corner.
So, at your workplace, have you got like user stories and agile stuff for as a developer, I want to question the status quo, and you assign, points.
I don't do that. There's some colleagues of mine here they do that, I think, but no, so everyone has their opinionated things. I don't like. I think some of that is just meta work. It's work around the work. So I'd rather make stuff as quickly as possible and not just writing user stories. Can be helpful, but it can also be a way to give yourself the feeling that you're doing work without actually doing any work.
But doing things as quickly as possible is exactly how we get into the situation where there's two layouts you can be designing. Right? If the point is, let's get this done, let's get it done quickly, fine. What do you want? 3 columns, done. It works. We know it works because all websites look the same.
Yeah?
But we want to be doing what you're telling us to do, Stephen. We do. We want to, push the boundaries and ask and question and.
Yeah, so, and what's holding you back from that?
But that where we work, they say, no, do what's quickest. We know it works.
Yeah, that's a challenge, and I think a lot of people end up choosing different places of work if they're not happy with that kind of thing. But sometimes you can try to change it. So that I'm trying to change it. I have colleagues who are trying to change it, and you have to get to a certain level and in the company and talk to the right people. But instead of just thinking, oh well, I'll leave the company, you could try to change things.
Good luck with that. I've got two questions here.
This is the most frustrating, frustrating interview ever. Oh man!
I got two questions.
I hate you. No.
I love you. One of these questions looks to the past. One looks to the future. Which do you want first, past or future?
Oh, future.
All right. So we're interviewing CSS for a job. Where do you see CSS in 5 years? This is from Sebastian Zachner.
Still doing better than AI.
Okay. Nice. Looking to the past, Josh Tumath asks, what do you miss about design trends in the old days of web design that you kind of wish we could bring back?
Nothing.
But come on, you're showing too advanced pixel fonts.
Yeah, but it's not because I didn't show those examples because I like them. I showed them because that's the kind of thing that was there. No, I tend to not like design trends, so I ignore I ignore as much as possible.
I want to go back to the point where you were picking on Chris Coyer, which is very mean. No, but you were. What Chris was talking about was design uniqueness. He said if design uniqueness were a lever that you could pull, whereas you pushed back and you talked about the importance of design. Mm-hmm. Now, those are two different things. Design. And in fact, the reason why we end up with the two layouts and the three columns is because it's proven, it's because design works. But there's a difference between design and design uniqueness. Or is good design inherently unique?
Not necessarily, but in many cases it is. So if you talk, there's a distinct identity, like a visual identity to a company like Apple, that is absolutely important to be unique compared to others. It's
and
very
that's why
important.
Everybody copies it.
Everyone copies it, but then Apple's the first. They'll change something. Apple was the first in many. I'm not like an Apple fanboy, but they've been the first in many areas, and people copy them. But I think that says something about how important that uniqueness is. Everyone wants it. It's unique, and now I want it. And that's not unique. They make something else. It's unique. Everyone wants it. It's the kind of it absolutely has value to the business. It's brand identity. So I think uniqueness does matter.
Yeah, but I think it matters a lot more to designers than it does to most people. Like, it's the designers getting like, you must use a distinct font because otherwise all these websites look the same. It's like most people don't care if they look the same as long as they can read them, right? Like, I feel like this is the kind of stuff designers really care about. Oh, like, I'll quote our mutual friend Andy Budd, who said once, design is more important than most CEOs think it is, but it isn't nearly as important as most designers think it is.
What do you want me to say?
What do you say to that, Stephen? No, I don't know, but I'm trying to get at this thing between uniqueness and good design. Like, the reason why we end up with, frankly, boring repetition is because, in a way, it's good, as in it does what it's supposed to do. At one time, it was even unique. Something that used to be unique is now boring because everyone does it. Where did it cross the line? When did it go from being good to being bad?
It's not that it's bad, it's that it could be better, so that uniqueness can make it better. People spend companies spend millions and millions of dollars on making a unique brand. They do that. And why do they do that? Throwing it back to you. Why did they do that?
Because somebody's got to spend that marketing budget. Actually, I've got a question here from Lucy, who is kind of saying better than I can what I've been trying to say, which is, does capitalism set a constraint on the design capabilities of a project?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. That's not a good thing, but it is a thing, yeah.
So, in a way, it's the ultimate constraint.
Yeah, I think there are probably a lot of existential threat constraints like things like capitalism, but there are probably many more. But that is a constraint. Those are, there are negative constraints. Yeah, absolutely.
And I've got another question in here when we're talking about looking to the future. Do you think CSS is kind of reaching a point where it's feature complete? You're starting to run out of things to wish for.
I've been thinking about that because I can't really think, except for slot, which I talked to Tab about last night, or a slot equivalent. I can't really think of anything else that I would need.
Yeah,
it's done. Congratulations.
It could be just that we're old, and so we lack imagination. We need young folks to come in and think.
Well, I think the color stuff, like Chris Lilly talked about the color stuff. When that's done, then it's done.
Going back to the process and trying to incorporate the kind of process you were showing us, which is kind of designing in the browser, right? Like
yeah, it is. Yeah.
Great, because that feels like a process of almost layering on, like you're building up.
Yeah.
You start with something, you style it a bit more, you add. Whereas what most people, I think, actually experience with somebody in the other building designs something in Figma and throws it over the wall, is something starts complete and high definition, and now you're supposed to try and reach for this. What was your famous saying? Photoshop is the best way.
The best way to show your clients what their website will never look like. Yeah.
Feels like there's a real mismatch there, and somehow the designing in the browser, it does feel like a more honest way to work.
Yeah, but it's also, I feel like, there are a lot of developers here, probably a lot of hybrid designer, developer people here, that I always feel like it should be a collaboration between a designer and a developer if you're in that situation where you're not doing it all on your own. And it just feels so unfair. There's so much CSS can do, and if you have a really good developer, you'll get ideas from them, and it just seems so unfair to say, here, I've thought about every possible thing in my Figma, and here you go, just execute that for me, please. You could learn a lot more and have a way better result if you collaborate, and you're missing that opportunity if you think, it's like sculpting. I use sculpting as a metaphor for playing around with CSS, because you're actually doing the sculpting. And if you're in a design tool before that, you're drawing a picture of what you want to sculpt, but you're not sculpting. You're drawing a picture of it. That's the problem I have with it. You're closing off any discovery that happens later.
Which brings it right back around to what Matthias was talking about at the start of the day, and trying to bring those two circles together. All right. Thank you very much, Stephen Hay. Off you go.